Hi everyone. So my name is Stephanie Stuzik, and this is my second video presentation for Macroeconomics 112. So in this presentation, I'll be covering several key topics of a discussion that connect together to explain how the economy works as a whole. This includes the trade deficits versus trade surpluses and how the economic way of thinking has changed after the 1930s with the rise of the Keynesian economics and how fiscal and monetary policies are used in order to stabilize the economy and manage the business cycle. So the business cycle is one of the last points or topics I'll be discussing. So I'll be connecting some of these ideas to real world examples for like the US trade deficit with China and how the Federal Reserve responds to recessions. And the overall goal is not to just explain or depict what those terms mean, but to show how they interact and influence everyday life and the broader economy. Okay, so moving on to an overview of the main topics like I discussed. So I'll start by explaining what the trade deficit versus trade surpluses mean and why they matter. Then I'll go over the what the economists thought before the 1930s and like their beliefs and what they thought was the right way of going about the economy. So, which is the idea that the economy could fix itself. But then John Maynard Keynes steps in and he completely changes that way of thinking after the Great Depression. Then I'll move into the monetary and fiscal policies and how they're used in order to stabilize growth and control inflation and prevent unemployment. And then finally, this is the business cycle. So this is essentially how government policy responds during different phases of the economy. Okay, so to begin, we have trade deficit. So a trade deficit happens when a country imports more goods and services than it exports. So this means that it buys more from other countries than it sells to them. So a brief example is that the United States has been in a trade deficit since the 1980s. So they imported things like electronics, oil cars, clothing from other countries like China, Japan, and Germany, while exporting airplanes, technology, and farm goods. So I'll get into a better example later in another slide. Here we have trade surplus. So a trade surplus, on the other hand, is the opposite of a trade deficit. So this happens when a country exports more than it imports. So countries such as China, Japan, South Korea usually run on surpluses because they sell more than they buy. And those are very large nations for exporting. They like we have China for almost everything that we use, uh clothing, just cloth and random thing, anything you pick up is just like made in China. And then we have Germany, which produces cars and vehicles and stuff like that. So Um, so basically, to sum it up, so trade deficit means that imports are greater than the exports. And then a trade surplus means that exports are greater than imports, but they are both normal outcomes of a global specialization. Okay, so now let's look at some real world examples of a trade deficit. So an example I could give is that the US has exported around $3.1 trillion worth of goods and services, but it imported $3.8 trillion, which creates a trade deficit of roughly 700 billion. Um, let's see. Another thing I could say is that the US ha trade deficit with China is because the US imports electronics, clothing, and machinery while exporting things like planes, agricultural like goods, software, technology, and things like that. Um, Now this is actually another good point, which is it was caused by a high consumer demand and a strong US dollar. So that's another key point, the strong US dollar. Now, of example of a trade surplus. So an example that I could give is Germany and Japan run on trade surpluses because they export cars and industrial equipment. So just these differences basically show that trade balances depend on each country and what each country produces most efficiently. So like I mentioned, for example, Germany is a big car car producing nation. So yeah, so the US, it's, for instance, if the US exports $600 billion worth of goods and imports $500 billion, then the trade surplus would be $100 billion. Now, to move on to um the pre-1930s conventional wisdom. So before the 1930s, most economists believed in a more classical economics, which is more often called the pre-1930s conventional wisdom. So the main idea of this was that the economy is self-regulating. So if a recession were to happen, falling wages and prices would eventually restore full employment. So this belief came from the Sly's law right here, or the Say's law, sorry, Say's law. So this stated that supply creates its own demand. So classical economists thought that the government should avoid interference with the economy, and so that the market would correct itself through the invisible hand. Oops, through the invisible hand. So if the unemployment rose, they believed that wages would fall until businesses could afford to hire people again and bring the economy back to balance. So the philosophy behind this was basically the laissez-faire, which means let it be. But later we will find out that that is not the greatest way of handling the economy, um, because it just doesn't work that way. The whole invisible hand concept about how unemployment, how it would help unemployment and government intervention would break rather than make economy better. Just wasn't very ideal. So that's why later we have the Keynesian economics, which was after the 1930s. So this was when after the Great Depression has hit, and the unemployment skyrocketed during that time, and businesses have closed and prices dropped, and the economy eventually did not fix itself, and it stayed stuck in just a deep ditch for a very long time, for many years. So that that failure of that way of thinking proved that something was missing from the classical model, and it opened the door for new ideas, such as this one. So then we move into Keynesian economics. So John Maynard Keynes came along and introduced this way of thinking, and it completely changed the economic like policies. So what he argued was that recessions are caused by inadequate spending, which is what he called the low aggregated demand. And when people and businesses cut back on spending, production slows and then the unemployment rises. So he believed that the government should actually intervene to boost the demand through the fiscal policy, um, which changes the taxes and the government spending. Um, so yeah, so that was a big point that the government should actually intervene and have a say in the economy rather than the other way of thinking, the pre-1930s, which was the idea that the government should not intervene and everything would restore on its own. So yes. So let's see the differences between these two ideas. So the key difference here is that in the pre-1930s economy, the economy they thought was self-correcting, and Say's law says that supply creates its own demand, and that the government should stay out of it, and everything would just go back on its own. And that recessions are temporary, and that the invisible hand would somehow create or restore a balance that was lost. But the Keynesian economics, on the other hand, believe that the economy can get stuck in a recession due to the low spending, and that government intervention can cause demand and create jobs. So that would help a lot. And demand creates its own supply, and policies like spending increase and tax cuts help the recovery. And the government plays a big and active role in stabilizing the economy. Okay, so monetary versus fiscal policy. So a monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve to make borrowing cheaper. So when inflation is high, it raises the rates to cool things down. So these actions influence how much people and businesses can spend. So and then the fiscal policy, on the other hand, is managed by the Congress and the president, and it involves changing taxes and government spending to stabilize the economy. So during recessions, the government uses expansionary fiscal policy, which is spending more and cutting taxes, but during inflation, it causes the contrary policy. Um, which is the reduced spending or raising taxes. So together, these two policies, the fiscal and the monetary, help to balance everything out and grow and stabilize the economy. Okay, so now let's talk about the business cycle. So the business cycle describes the natural rise and fall of economic activity. And there are four phases. So we have the expansion, which is the growth and rising of employment. Then we have peak, which is the highest point before it slows down finally. And then recession is a decline in GDP and jobs. And then we have drought, which is the lowest point before recovery in the end. So modern policies help to smooth out these cycles. So like an example would be during the 2020 pandemic, during COVID, both the fiscal and monetary actions like stimulus checks and low interest rates help the economy to recover at a faster rate. And then here we have the difference between recession and expansion. So recession is a negative in the GDP growth, and it has a rise in unemployment and reduced consumer spending, and this is where employment is declining. Now, expansion is the opposite, a complete opposite, which is a positive GDP growth, falling unemployment, which means more employment, and then rising confidence and spending, so more spending and things like that. And this is where production and employment are at a peak, at a very high, so it's increasing. So recession is basically contractions and expansion is recoveries from that. So let's move on to the summary. So to sum everything up, so trade deficits and surpluses reflect the global um, connections, and the shift from classical to Keynesian economics show that the government policy can play a very powerful role in stabilizing demand and promoting growth. And now the monetary and fiscal policies help to manage inflation, employment, and the business cycle. So, and all of these are not just theories, but they help to understand how government and people respond to challenges to help the economy and the nation to keep everything stabilized and prosperous. So I hope this kind of gave an understanding of how everything works and what everything means, and just the way it comes together to everyday life. And yes, so thank you everyone for watching and listening to my presentation.